You've had this on the go for a while.
Well, yes.
And so how do you stay passionate about something over, because my research sort of dredged up that you've been thinking about this for about a decade now.
Yes, even more. But how do you, I don't know. I think it's just sheer stubbornness.
Yeah.
It's once you get your teeth into something creatively, you never really let go. I mean, there was no guarantee that it would ever get made. And I suppose, I would still be fighting if DreamWorks didn't decide to make it, because I brought it to them in 2005.
And wasn't it originally partially live action? And
well, just the first conversation that we had with there were two people. It was Tiffany Ward, was Jay Ward's daughter, and Classic Media, and they were controlling the rights, and they suggested, I think, live action. And it didn't take very long for me to kind of come around to the idea that I would prefer to do it as an animated thing, just because I didn't understand how it would work as a live action thing, and it would sort of lose some of its intrinsic appeal. Part of the kind of quirkiness of it and the absurdity of the dog and his boy sort of plays because partly people don't recognize or care that he is a dog.
Right.
And that's sort of the fun of it. So doing an animation seemed like the best way.
Did you have a look back at some of the other live action films? Because for some reason, and I know you won't speak poorly of other filmmakers in this situation, but for some reason, nobody seems to be able to get, or has up until this point, gotten the tone of Jay Ward's stuff on the big screen, from the small screen to the big screen.
Well, thank you. I don't know. I think it was because I'm a fan, and I loved it. But at the same time, I didn't want to try to copy exactly what it was, because I couldn't possibly do that. So it was sort of taking somehow the spirit of it and letting that be. I don't know, maybe trying to get to the core of what it is as opposed to the surface, because a lot of people, when I first started on the movie, they sort of assumed, it would be 2D animation, or it even looked like intentionally primitive.
Right.
And for me, that would be like a kind of a meta commentary on the original, and it's sort of like that wasn't exactly what I thought would make sense. It was really just sort of saying, who are these characters? What do they do? How do they think? And then trying to make sure that the comedy, the level of writing, the intelligence of it was somehow, at the level that they had done it at the time, because that was, I think, really what Jay Ward was known for. I mean, it was always popular among sort of college-educated, smarter people. And so that was something we sort of felt was really important, and then at the same time making it kid-friendly,
Well, it's the only kids movie that has an Oedipus joke, I think, very likely. Yes. And you can't have your cake and eat it too, all that stuff.
Right.
Which is a direct. I went home last night and looked up a bunch of stuff on YouTube and played a lot of these back, and played how to be a beatnik, with the moose. And I was really taken with a lot of it because it's really smart, and it's smarter than I remember it being as a kid, because I didn't get a lot of it, right?
Well, exactly.
So it probably went right over my head. Yeah. And so it struck me that the Jay Ward stuff always worked on two levels. There's the surface level,
right?
Giggly, funny, kids will like it, right. But then there's the satire as well.
Yes, exactly. So that was, I think because we were fans of that, we were trying to, bring that into this film as well.
Yeah, and it works. I mean, it works. The political aspect seems to be gone. I mean, the Cold War's not on anymore, and I guess
that was really a Bullwinkle thing.
Yeah.
I mean, the Boris and Natasha, and it was funny because even at the time they would say, or Boris and Natasha Russians.
Yeah. And
Jay Ward's answer was, no, of course they're not. They're from Pennsylvania.
Yeah.
So
between Minnesota and Canada.
Yes. Exactly. So we didn't. Peabody Sherman wasn't particularly political in that way.
Right, but very.
But if it was, I mean, the very first version that I developed for DreamWorks was definitely had more satire.
Right, and how do you gauge or find the balance? I guess because you're juggling a lot of things here. You're juggling, characters that people certainly of my generation are very fond of. You're juggling satire for the adults. You've got to have it kid-friendly for the kids. Plus, there's an educational component in here. And the educational component, I mean, I think is more like later on, maybe the parents will have a talk. This is who King Tut was, and that's... Of course. But you got to balance it all.
Well, but I guess, so for me, my memory of the show was that I got introduced to people I didn't know who they were, and yet I was interested in them because I figured if Mr. Peabody thought they were important, then they probably were important. I probably should know something about them. And you meet them, and you find out sort of always why you met them. Like, what was the reason? They obviously had done something remarkable enough to be remembered, and because it's funny and, you know, kind of crazy, obviously, sort of makes an impression on you as a kid, and then later you sort of come back around to it in school.
Yeah.
And I think what I found, I actually always liked history classes. They were sort of my favorite classes. Maybe partly because of Jay Ward, because my introduction to history was that it was funny and fun and interesting and something that, you know, you'd kind of want to do. And just this whole notion of time travel and that they were alive, that was probably a very subtle, unintended thing. You know, this notion that it's not just a name or a date. Because that's, I think, where people get into the sort of like, history's boring. And it's actually not. History's not boring at all. It's just sort of a great story. And if it's told well, of course you're going to be interested. If it's not a story that's told well, or if people don't appreciate the fact that it is a story, if they just sort of say, here's some facts and here's some numbers, and it's not, history isn't science. You know, and I think sometimes it's taught as if it is science, but it's not.
Certainly was to me.
Science.
I mean, no, history. It was taught like it was science to me. I would come in, my history teacher used to fill blackboards with notes, and we had to write the notes down and just memorize dates.
Scads of stuff.
Didn't mean anything.
And no, and when it's told as a story, it comes to life. And when it comes to life, that's when it's interesting. It's suddenly relevant. Like, oh, there's a character and a theme and a story and a conflict and resolution and heroes and villains, and, you know, history is filled with stories. Sort of, you know, and I kind of hope people sort of embrace that aspect of it, because I think it's, I'll tell you, more than once making the movie, that was always kind of thrown at us as a kind of a danger. They're like, oh, it's history. We don't want to do history. It's educational. We just stay away from that. And the truth is, it wasn't really our intention. We weren't trying to be educational. So it wasn't really even that. It was like, okay, this is really in the service of fun and comedy. But at the same time, why not? At the same time, it's great, you know, that you can introduce these ideas, and hopefully kids will just go, oh, I want to know more. Yeah,
I think the King Tut stuff will grab kids for sure. The Trojan horse thing is a cool story if you don't know it. You know, all that stuff. So, and the Leonardo da Vinci stuff, very cool. Tell me a little bit about casting, because you've got Ty Burrell, who has a very interesting kind of speech pattern on his show that we all know of him, which is missing from the movie. He does more of an impression of the original Mr. Peabody.
Well,
and it's interesting because so often celebrities are hired to sound exactly like themselves. And I thought that was really interesting too.
Well, I think I'm not sure that Phil Dunphy is necessarily Ty. So there's a subtle, I think, because you met him as Phil Dunphy, you're that's who Ty Burrell is. I mean, he would never claim to be, you know, he sort of says he's probably more like Phil than he is like Peabody in terms of intelligence and being a genius. But there was something, I think, about him that we responded to, and it was really kind of the warmth of his voice, because Peabody, who's sort of super intelligent, needed that balance. You know, you needed to kind of care, and you needed to feel like he was a good father, even if he can't express himself emotionally. But that, you know, that needed to be there, and so that's why. And it was interesting too, because very often in these conversations, you know, you do talk about who's the big star to be in the movie because they're meaningful. Jeffrey Katzenberg would he looked at a list of people, and it would shock you because every name on the list was somebody famous, somebody that you knew, somebody that you would consider a big star. And he'd say, well, there's only 2 people in here that mean anything. You're like, what? Wow. Well, it's 2 people that mean anything from...
On a poster, you mean?
On a poster, that means something on a talk show, that means that... Well, and Ty Burrell wasn't even on that first list. Modern Family maybe had just come out, so, you know, it was first season, and, you know, it was a good show, obviously, but nobody kind of knew it was going to be a giant hit. So when the idea of Ty Burrell came up, I had never heard him. I hadn't actually seen the show yet, and he came in for an audition, which he wouldn't have done if he was a big star. Right. And that was great because we got to actually work with him. And Tiffany Ward, who's Jay Ward's daughter, who's been the custodian of all of these properties for such a long time, felt very concerned about who played Mr. Peabody and how they played him, and she would have been really happy if we did an absolute sound-alike for Bill Scott, who was the original Mr. Peabody. And I worried about that because I never really liked sound-alikes, because knowing the original really bugs me. Like even Kermit the Frog, the character I love, when it's not Jim Henson, it kind of bugs me because I know it's somebody doing that. And so I hear that it's not that person. It sort of misses something in the soul department. So I kind of didn't want to do a strict sound alike. I thought, it's a new movie. It's going to look different. It's made 50 years later. It should be new and different, and but it has to be the character.
Yeah.
So I would think of it like Sherlock Holmes. We've seen how many dozens of actors playing Sherlock Holmes over the years, and everybody is different. And yet, essentially, it's always Conan Doyle's Sherlock Holmes. You say, I know who that is, and he's never really changes essentially. So I thought, let's do the same for Peabody. He's a character. Actors can play this role, and so when we hired Ty, he came in for the audition, and we played it for Tiffany, and Tiffany said, not quite there yet. And we said, well, he's a good actor, and we'll work with him. And so he did. He actually spent time listening to Bill Scott's performance and made it his own ultimately. But we encouraged him to
took
be
the cadence or something.
The cadence, exactly. And so we encouraged him to do that, and it was just like any actor would create a character. It takes some time to kind of find it and then dial it in, and then it becomes a kind of a solid thing. Like, how many characters did Jim Henson do besides Kermit?
Yeah, exactly. Or
each one,
or any of them. Yeah,
exactly.
Yeah.
You kind of, but they evolve, and then they kind of get set.
Right. Were you a fan as a kid?
Oh, of Mr. Peabody Sherman?
Of
Bullwinkle and Jay Ward?
Jay Ward, the whole
Absolutely.
thing.
I watched all of them all the time. Yeah. I was alive when it was first on the air. Yeah. I can't recall necessarily if I'd seen it, but I probably did.
Same with me.
The images. But it played pretty consistently through the 60s and early 70s at least. And I remember seeing it, and whenever it came on the air, I would watch it. And so I've seen all of the episodes multiple times, and was always a fan. And I don't think I don't recall having thought, that would make a great movie someday. It didn't occur to me that way. In fact, it all started 12 years ago with a conversation I had with Jason Clarke, who is an executive producer on the movie, who now produced the movie Ted, and he produced A Million Ways to Die in the West, which is the new Seth MacFarlane. And we worked together on Stuart Little, which is when we had the first conversation. And he came to me and said, what do you think of Mr. Peabody and Sherman? And literally, my answer was, I love them. I love Mr. Peabody and Sherman. And he said, what about making a movie out of it? And I thought, they're great characters. There's a lot to them. There's a kind of a unexplored well of stuff. There's the time machine, time travel. Obviously, those things never gone out of
origin too, right? You have to create an origin story because they were just segments on.
Well, they were, but surprisingly, people don't know this because a lot of people think somehow that Sherman was his pet. And that's the way they perceived it.
Right.
But in the pilot episode of the original, Mr. Peabody adopts Sherman. And we actually, I have to say, we ripped it off. We borrowed it.
Yeah.
Since but we took a lot of the material that was actually in that pilot episode and used it in the film. And the reason it was interesting because we started the movie in France. We actually had a cold open. We just started the movie, didn't explain anything, because I sort of thought, well, why should we explain anything?
Yeah.
People will know, people will understand. And of course, the people that didn't understand just was like, what's the relationship between the characters and how did this all come about? So we added the prologue, and literally half of what it is actually came from the original. So we didn't really change it that much. We tweaked the idea about when he finds Sherman, because in the original, Sherman is already a 10-year-old boy, however old he is in the show, and he finds him being beat up by bullies, and then he saves him, takes him back to the orphanage. The orphanage master is terrible to Sherman, and Mr. Peabody decides to rescue him from that, takes him to the judge, and the judge says, if a boy can adopt a dog, I see no reason why a dog cannot adopt a boy. And that was a line we said, well, we've got to use that in the movie. Is
Mr. Peabody the proto Brian from Family Guy?
Yes, I think that's been acknowledged. I think Seth MacFarlane is a fan, and I think he has given credit.
Oh, good. Because it had never occurred to me until I saw the movie yesterday.
And then you're like,
this is a straight line here. Yeah. I assume you live in LA.
I do.
Yeah. You must have driven past the giant
Bullwinkle statue.
Yeah, which is gone now.
times.
So sad that it's...
Well, actually, the good news is that it was rescued by DreamWorks. Tiffany Ward, the daughter, owns that building, but the current tenant did not want the statue. It's been there forever, and everyone has accepted it except the current tenant, and so they insisted she take it away, and DreamWorks volunteered to take the statue and refurbish it and fix it up, and we don't know where it's going to have a home eventually, maybe on the DreamWorks campus, but it has not gone away.
Oh, good. When you as a fan of the original animated show, because when I first went to LA, that was one of the things I wanted to see. The first time I went, it was a landmark like Tale of the Pop to me. One of those things, right? You got to see all this stuff. Did it resonate with you at all?
Which?
Driving the statue driving past it all the time?
Absolutely. Dudley Do-Ride's Emporium. I was very disappointed when I heard it was going out of business and they were going to close it up. But the statue was absolutely a landmark. And there's a great story too, hilarious, that Tiffany told. She explained that her dad, when he bought the building, was in the early '60s, and the real estate agent said, here's the building, here's how much it costs, and I don't know if you want or are interested, but there's this billboard. And he said, okay, sure, I'll take that too.
That's the
billboard on Sunset Boulevard.
My God.
Yeah. Oh my God. I think she's gets $50,000 a month.